In this video, we're going to start off at the bare bones basics, starting off with defining what a continuation bet is. Then we're going to revisit reasons to bet. And then lastly, we're going to take a look at some example hands to illustrate continuation betting. So what is a continuation bet? Well, I know that most of you already know what it is, but I want to make sure that we define it because this is a C-Betting 101 course and we're going to have players from all over, from different types of experience levels, and some of you may not fully understand what it is. So first off, we commonly call a continuation bet a C-bet, so if you hear that, it's the same thing. So what is it? Well, it's when a player who bet or raised in the prior round of betting continuation bets, or they continue with a bet again on the current round of betting. So what do I mean? Well, for example, if we open raise pre-flop, somebody calls, we go to the flop and we bet again, that would be a continuation bet. Let's extend on to that. Let's say that we get raised on the flop and then we call that raise and then that person bets the turn. Well, they took over the initiative by raising the hand, and then when they bet the turn, they are C-betting the turn. So that's why we have bet or raised here. So that's the definition of a C-bet. Now, when we talk about C-betting, we can C-bet on the flop, we can C-bet on the turn, or we can C-bet on the river. And I'll talk about delayed C-betting on the next lecture and in the next video, but there is standard C-betting and there is delayed C-betting, and I don't want to get into that in this video because I dedicated an entire video to it. Now, when we're talking about C-betting the flop, turn, and the river, you'll commonly hear firing a single barrel, firing a second barrel, or firing a triple barrel, which I've highlighted some of the wording down here. And what that means is that when somebody fires a single barrel, it means that they are C-betting the flop. If they're firing a second barrel, it means they C-bet the flop and they C-bet the turn. And if they're firing a triple barrel, it means that they're C-betting the flop, the turn, and the river. So if you hear those, that's what it means. Now, let's revisit the reasons to bet. I know this, again, is very basic stuff, and I've covered this in other courses, but I want to make sure we cover it again in here. So there are two primary reasons for betting in poker, and there's only two. You can either bet for value, or you can bet as a bluff. No other primary reasons other than that. Now, of course, we can break those down even further, which I'll do right now, when we're talking about betting for value. There are typically three different things that we talk about with that. We are either doing a thick value bet, meaning we have a very strong hand and we're value betting it. There is what we call a thin value bet, which is essentially we have a hand that we think if we bet for value, then we're going to get called by worse more often than we're going to get called by better. And then thirdly, there is the protection bet, where we're betting for value, but we're also betting to protect our equity, typically on a wet board texture. Now, in terms of betting for value, it's not the same thing as saying I am betting the best hand. When you are betting for value, you're saying that I think I have the best hand, and if I bet here, there's a very high probability that people are going to call me with the worst hand. And that's the whole premise of value betting, is that we're betting to get value from worse hands, meaning they're going to call. Saying that I think that I have the best hand here, so I'm going to bet, that's not value betting. That's just saying, well, I have the best hand, I'm going to bet, I hope somebody calls. So those are the three different subcategories and the reasons for value betting. Now, again, I'm not taking a deep dive look into this because I'm assuming a lot of you already know what this stuff is because it's pretty basic. Now, let's talk about bluffing. So when we're talking about bluffing, there are two different categories. There is the pure bluff and there is a semi-bluff, so pretty straightforward. If we have a really crappy hand that has a very low probability of improving, but we think we have good fold equity, meaning we think our opponents are going to fold a lot, then we can bet as a pure bluff. Now, when we have a drawing hand that has a decent probability of improving on the next route of action or by the end of the hand, that's what we consider a semi-bluff. So again, I want to make sure that you understand what these are, because as we're going through this course and we're talking about continuation betting, we're doing it for particular reasons. We are either C-betting for value, either thick value or thin value. And one thing that I do want to talk about when we're talking about thick value to thin value, think of this as a spectrum. It's just not that, well, I have a thick value hand and I have a thin value hand. It's a spectrum from a really strong value hand all the way to a very thin value hand. So think about it that way. And then of course we are sometimes value betting, plus we're also betting for protection, where we're trying to deny our opponents the free equity or the easy way to improve their hand on the next street. So we want to deny their equity by protection betting. So it's going to be protection plus thin value or protection plus thick value. And then lastly, we're either c-betting as a bluff, either as a pure bluff or as a semi-bluff. So those are the reasons for betting. Now let's take a look at some example hands, because this really illustrates everything. So we're going to start off where I have ace king offsuit on the button. So we have a raise from under the gun. I put in a 3-bet. Both of the blinds fold. Under the gun calls. We go to the flop. I flop top pair, top kicker, and I block the nut flush draw. And so we're in a 3-bet pot. Villain checks. We fire out a continuation bet. Villain calls. We go to the turn. We still have top pair, top kicker in a 3-bet pot. He checks again. We bet again. This would be firing a second barrel or c-betting on the turn. He calls. We go to the river, 5 of hearts. He checks. We bet again. So we're firing a third barrel with top pair, top kicker in a 3-bet pot, going all in, and then he folds. So this is a very simple example of firing 3 barrels or c-betting the flop, the turn, and the river as the pre-flop aggressor. So let's take a look at example hand number 2. So we have pocket eights in this example. Action folds around to us. We are on the button. We put in a raise on the button as a steal attempt. We get a call from the small blind. Big blind folds. We go to the flop. We have an overpair on, I would say, a semi-dry / semi-wet board texture. It's dry because it's a paired board, but also there are the presence of a lot of draws here, since there is a 6 and a 7. So 5-4 has a straight draw, 7-8 has a straight draw, even though we block that. 7-9 8-9, and I didn't mean to say 7-8, but I meant to say 8-9. You can even say 9-10. So yeah, the gutter draws as well. There's a lot of draws here that can complete on the turn. So we fire out a continuation bet with our overpair for a combination of a value bet plus protection, meaning we're protecting our equity. We don't want to allow him to freely try to realize his equity if he has draw in hand. He calls. We go to the turn. This is a great turn for us because it improves a lot of the straight draws, or also gives him some additional equity, possibly a pair plus a straight draw, but we've boated up, so we really want him to improve here. He checks, we bet again, he calls, we go to the river, relative blank, he checks, we bet again, and he folds. So this is a combination of betting for protection and value in this hand. All right, so let's go to our third example. We have 9-8 suited of clubs on the button. We put in a steal attempt raise on the button, get a call from small blind, get a fold from big blind, go to the flop. We flop a really low flush draw, and I'm not going to say really low, it's a middling strength flush draw. And our opponent checks, the action's on us, we bet here. Why are we betting here? Well, of course, we're betting for value, right? We have a very strong hand, but we have a very vulnerable hand as well. So here we are betting for a combination of thick value plus protection, because if we think about it, if there is any club higher than ours that hits the board, or actually any club at all, we're not going to be happy. Because let's say our opponent has potentially the king of clubs or the queen of clubs, and they have a straight draw, or potentially they have a pair plus a draw. We don't want to see a club. So our hand is vulnerable to those clubs. And we also get value because our opponents are going to call us with draws, they're going to call us with pair of aces, they're going to call us with a straight draw in a button versus small blind, blind versus blind situation. So we get value from a lot of weaker hands as well. Our opponent calls, we go to the turn, complete blank, opponent checks, we bet again, expecting to get a call. Our opponent calls. We go to the river. Again, a relative blank unless our opponent was calling with 8-9, which I think is highly unlikely. I think that we're going to get called down a lot by a pair of aces here. So our opponent checks. Again, we bet a third time for value. Our opponent calls. Let's see what they had. And our opponent had a pair of aces. So again, if our opponent did have, let's say, ace queen, ace king, yes, they would sometimes 3-bet those, or king 10, queen 10, jack queen, where one of those are the clubs, or king jack, any of those, then we are going to be in trouble if any club hits the turn. All right, so let's take a look at one more hand, and let me reverse this up so you can see the action from the beginning. So we have pocket 10, so there is a raise from under the gun, and we decide to cold call on the button with pocket 10s. Again, definitely not a hand that we want to 3-bet as a bluff versus an under the gun open raising range. We have two short stack opponents here, so the odds of them 3-betting us is probably going to be fairly low, and this is a hand that's actually strong enough to call 3-bet as well. So anyways, I just wanted to explain the reasoning for calling there. So we end up flopping middle set here on a 10-jack 5 two-tone board texture, semi-wet board texture with the presence of flush draws and straight draws. And with our opponent under the gun open raising range, they can definitely have jack X, they can have 10X hands, they can have flush draws, they can have straight draws, they can have over pairs. So it's a really great flop for us on this board texture. So our opponent leads out with a fairly small c-bet, and of course on a wet board texture where we are repping, I would say, polarized hand here, because we are going to be raising with two pair, we're going to be raising with sets, we're going to be raising with flush draws, and we're going to be raising with straight draws sometimes. So we put in the raise here as a pre-flop caller. Our opponent calls, and now we've taken over the initiative in the hand. The turn card really isn't that great of a turn card because the flush does come in. But again, flushes are typically going to be within our range and not our opponent's. Our opponent is typically going to be calling us here with a pair. And we're going to be raising here polarized, meaning we have bluffs and value bets here. So this actually improves our range more than our opponent's when we raise there. Our opponent checks. We fire out a continuation bet. So why are we c-betting here when the flush does come in? Well, again, I think my opponent calls here with a lot of pairs. Yes, sometimes they're going to have a flush. But our hand, we're not only repping flushes, which we actually didn't want the diamond to come here because it's a bit of an action killer. We were hoping for a blank to extract value, but we are betting here for a combination of value and protection. Again, protecting our equity. What happens if our opponent has a hand like king jack, ace jack, ace 10, king 10, and they're calling that raise one time, and one of those is a diamond? Well, we don't want to allow them to freely realize their equity on the river by checking back here. So we bet for protection and we bet for value here. And our opponent folds and we take it down. So I wanted to show this example because we didn't have the pre-flop initiative, right? We just called pre-flop. And so what we ended up doing was we ended up raising the flop to take back the initiative. And by doing so, when our opponent calls and our opponent checks, we have the opportunity to c-bet the turn. So c-betting isn't only a terminology that we use for the pre-flop raiser. It's also for somebody that raises post-flop, that takes over the initiative, and then c-bets on a later round. So that's going to conclude our basic introduction to c-betting. Again, in summary, we defined what a c-bet was. We revisited the reasons to bet. And let me go ahead and minimize all these and get back to here. So we revisited the reasons to bet. We defined what a c-bet is. And we went over 4 different hand examples to illustrate c-betting, just to really drill it in. So anyways, appreciate you guys for watching this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys at the next video. Take care.